Frazer, really it's felt as though the building has been his for the last few weeks, given the success of the exhibition and given the success of the lectures which you planned around this series. And this evening, really, I suppose he's going to kind of summarize and to draw together some of the themes that have been worked over. So I'd like to welcome both John and indeed Julia Frazer.
Thank you, Mark. And before I forget, I'd like to thank Mark for paying for this lecture series. And I'd like to thank the visiting lecturers, especially. I mean, that along the way, out of their way enormously to come and contribute to the series. I'd like to thank the audience for so determinedly turning up throughout. And I'd like also, because I always have this problem over whether to say I or we. If I say I, it sounds like it's my work. If it sounds like we, ever since Thatcher and the world, we have a problem over that. Almost all the work that I'm talking about is being done collaboratively with colleagues, with my wife and friends, with research students, and most particularly and especially with my students at the AA. So everything I say embraces all of them, even if I forget to say so at the time. And when I say I mean we, and when I say we, I do not mean manufacturer. If I could have the projector on, please, Joel, and the organizer of the 35 minute slides, that would be great. I'm dedicating this lecture to the first building intelligent enough to understand and appreciate the gesture. I confidently expect that such a building will have designed and constructed itself in response to the needs of its users and acting in harmony with its environment. It will be self-sustaining, it will exhibit metabolism, it will derive order from its environment and be controlled by a symbiotic relationship with its inhabitants and that environment. And when it's outlived its usefulness, it will self-destruct and redistribute its resources. This lecture is to that first building and I hope that it won't be too long. What I have to do first, though, is a little recapitulation. I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning showing slides I'm afraid some of you may have seen before, but in a very much abbreviated form. And I'm going to try and explain some of the sources of information we've been using, because I feel that we haven't been specific enough about where these ideas are being derived from, and I want to put that balance right. I want to touch on each of the other speakers as I go past. The Sources Apprentice at the beginning, the Sources Apprentice is the name for one of the computer models that we developed quite late on in this sequence, whose significance I will try to remember to return to if it doesn't escape me in the heat of the moment. And Yasha Reichardt gave a timely warming with her delightful talk about Frankenstein, about the problems of our dealing with technology and people's fear of this. And that we do not know what we're doing. You are stepping into the unknown, and there's a timely warning. And Margaret Bowden talked about creativity, and one of the things that's very obvious, or I hope in what I'm saying, is that we're trying to shift the role and the position of creativity. Clearly, we're not expecting people to operate, or architects to operate in the normal manner. They're being asked if they're extent. Now, I actually don't believe this is so odd. I think most architects work that way. They have a generating concept, they have a generic idea, which informs all their ideas, which they then mutate and develop for particular sites and situations. So I don't believe in that sense I'm proposing anything particularly odd. What is slightly unusual is propose that it should then be computerized and that the machine should then take over, thereby changing the potential role between the architect, the machine, and the user, because the user and the inhabitant of the building can then start to interfere at an unusual and different level. But I offer in turn for this, I offer architects immortality. We can put their ideas, as with Walter Siegel, his sad death just after he'd seen the model we built for him in the exhibition. Nevertheless, we have all of the rules, all of his ideas encapsulated on silicon, so that forever we can go on building Walter Siegel ideas. I'm worried by this concept for a number of reasons, but nevertheless, the offer of immortality I thought might appeal to architects. Apparently that's a big enough offer. Then I offer sainthood, the idea that by dealing with serious ecological problems, that architects could feel that they have some virtuous role. Apparently not. So tonight I'm going to offer deification. This is my last offer. I can't go further than this. I'm going to start with Wagons. This is to remind us that, I'm sorry, I didn't have time just to focus these before I came in. If Joel, if you wouldn't mind just checking out the right-hand one particularly. Nudge it over. This is to remind us that there have always been both an unself-conscious tradition and a self-conscious tradition in design. If you've never read it, there's a most wonderful book called Wheelwright's Shop by someone called George Sturt, who was unusual because he was responsible for building wagons, but was also articulate and literate. He therefore was able to record the tradition. And these wagons, if you've never seen them, have extraordinarily strange features. They have dished wheels which are set at an angle. They have strangely straight spokes. They have extraordinarily wasted construction. What is all this about? And in the book, George Sturt explains how these designs evolved over a long time scale and the particular functional problems that these designs addressed. The same is probably true of a lot of vernacular architecture. I would suggest that isn't a very useful model for the future, whatever Prince Charles may think, because it isn't able to move fast enough. And as I said in the introductory talk 3 weeks ago, shaking buildings to death in an earthquake is a rather ruthless way of going about testing things. And anyway, it probably doesn't test the more significant problems of social inadequacy in architecture. So that however delightful this tradition of evolving form unsubconsciously is, I don't think it answers current problems. And I think it's irrelevant and inappropriate for me now to comment on my views on the failure of the mainstream self-conscious tradition architecture. I think it's failed at every level, although I, like many people in this room, dearly love some of the buildings that have resulted from that process. Therefore, we're proposing an alternative, which is to encapsulate some of this process in the computer, to use the computer as an evolutionary turbocharger, to accelerate evolutionary time and space in some way. So the intention is that somehow the extreme subtlety and refinement of producing these beautiful wagons, for example, is somehow encapsulated into some development process. And I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about how this is done. First, though, I'm going to show you 2 or 3 things you have seen before, and just bear with this. These are reminders. We were reminded earlier in the course by Adrian Bell and Rupert Sheldrake yesterday that we still do not have a theory in science of morphogenesis, of the idea of creating and generating form, nor do we in architecture. This interests me because there seems to be an assumption that if you look at something like DNA, on the left is the original model by Crichton Watson, on the right is a more easily legible. You're all familiar with this spiral of 4 nucleotides interlocking in pairs, the coding of which produces all the variety of life in this room and outside of nature, of trees, of plants, of every living species. Not only that, but their behaviour and the evolutionary process. But as Sheldrake pointed out, that is not enough. As Bell pointed out, that does not tell you everything you need to know about how a tree comes into being. There are some subtitles to this lecture, one of which is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, as you have gathered from the introduction. A second subtitle is Chamberlain and the Beautiful Llama, which I suspect, since there's no response, will require a little further explanation in due course. And the other one is The Hidden Agendas. And there is a hidden agenda here, which is, and I'll come clean on this, science is going to have a great deal of difficulty in producing a general morphogenetic model. That is, how do you get from the packet of seeds on the right to the spinach on the left? Just in case you haven't seen spinach growing wild, that's what it looks like. And I usually say at this point, and I won't resist the temptation again, that 1/3 of the DNA of spinach is in common with every one of you in this room. It's a humbling thought and always worth remembering. What is that process? And we do not know or understand it. I'm going to suggest that those in the creative fields, like architecture, architecture are best placed at the moment to create an artificial model of such a process. And in a sense, we are being dependent heavily in the exhibition, book, and this lecture series on biological analogies. I want to return the compliment to say, in return, we could provide an abstract, artificial model of a complete morphogenetic process that goes all the way from initial conception right through to individualized final form. If we did that, we would provide science enormous service because it would be value-free. You don't have to worry. I mean, Sheldrake posed a problem. I don't know how many of you thought what he proposed as a solution was valid. I suspect most of science doesn't take it seriously. I think what he has to say is interesting and challenging, and I'm intrigued by the way in which science pushes these people to the edges. Nevertheless, the challenge is there. We don't have to worry about whether he's right or wrong. More to the point, though, if architecture, for example, as a discipline, produces a model of the whole of the creative, generative process, which is totally self-consistent and works, that would be of huge value to science. They don't have to say, this is how actually spinning is, whatever. They're not faced with that problem. They say, but, for instance, we have a model of this. We can see parallels. And I feel that architecture should be less afraid as a discipline, less dependent upon always relying on inputs from these other sciences in these ways, and should be quite prepared to say, this is our specialization. Our specialization is creating such generative models. And I'm talking about one particular one. I'm talking about several that have resulted from our unit's work. But around me in the room are other people I know who also have in their mind, their own particular way of doing other generative models. And I like to feel that we are strong enough as a discipline to say we have something to tell the world about how form is generated and these fundamental creative processes. And I have a feeling that Margaret Bowden's lecture, however much you might have enjoyed it, somehow she didn't quite touch on the fundamental issues. Most people in this room have experienced that creative moment, that extraordinary leap, when ideas in some particular way are the paradigm shifts, the connection to it, and you've had this extraordinary moment, which is what generates and drives our daily lives. Don't be afraid of saying that. Don't be afraid of saying to people who clearly have never had such a moment, hang on a minute, you don't quite understand what this is about. We have something to tell you too. So this is a little bid for architecture to come out of the closet a bit and say that it understands some of these processes. We also know some things, like the tadpole on the left comes from the spherically symmetrical cell on the right by a process of cellular division. I'm going to return in a moment if I remember. I have a habit in lectures you might have noticed, which is to say I'll return to that later and then I completely forget what it was I was going to return to. The lectures, if you listen to the tapes, are full of such notice. Try and remember tonight. I'm hoping to leave time for questions, and I'm quite happy to take interruptions. Alan Turing, who I'll come to in a moment, pointed out that we start life as a spherically symmetrical cell, and we're quite clearly not spherically symmetrical any longer, but we have elements of it still. We're still, at least broadly speaking, bilaterally symmetrical, two of each thing down the outside, one of each thing up the middle, and some elements of cylindrical symmetry left over. How does this process occur? It does it by cellular division under genetic control. The DNA is in every single one of the cells as it divides. Nature alternates between extraordinary economy and gross over a profligate misuse of resources. The elegance of using just 4 nucleotides to describe the whole of life, DNA, 4 of them, a combination, those 4 map to RNA. The RNA in triplets forms amino acids. The amino acids, 26 of them, those produce a chemical factory which generates proteins, which is you. The miracle you manage to turn whatever it is you consume during the day, the cliche that you are what you eat. It is nevertheless an extraordinary process that you manage to turn whatever it is you consume during the day into whatever is needed for your body growth and development. That extraordinary chemical factory, again, doesn't tell us everything. That's economical, but then on the other hand, we have profligate prototyping on a mammoth scale. Millions of seeds falling off a tree, most of which will not grow. Billions of permutations, most of which come to nothing. Nature is one vast food factory, one thing up the chain eating the next. Vast, and the idea that it copied the whole of the DNA code, billions of nucleotide pairs into every single cell of your body, the extraordinary overkill of this gesture requires some thought and pause for consideration. I'm going to dismiss this in 2 seconds. Most of you have seen it before. This is what happened earlier on, and I've gone long past it. It's merely to remind you that what we can't do is invent an architectural building kit with a one-to-one idea. Therefore, the idea of each elemental symbol, we have some structural element. This is interesting to me at this early stage because we found a way of expressing an architectural concept in a genetic and generic form, thereby enabling it to generate these structures in the computer of its own volition, but it nevertheless is severely constrained by the nature of this particular geometry and structural system. That isn't the answer, so how do we move forward and start to generalize? I'm going to now just quickly run through a few tools. We've mentioned the cellular automata, a brilliant lecture by Mike Lesser earlier on the course, where he talked about the organization of cellular automata. If you missed the lecture, a cellular automata is simply something where each cell depends upon the states of its neighbor and some transition rules, from which we learn that simple rules generate complex forms, the initial seed has an effect, and each step is affected by the previous steps. In other words, it's strictly deterministic. And it has various behaviors which are interesting on the left. It may die out, become periodic, become permanent, chaotic. And again, Michael said that's not possible since it's deterministic. How can you possibly be so stupid as to say it can be permanently chaotic? Well, I'm borrowing Stephen Wolfram, and he was, I thought, the expert until I met Mike Lesser. Anyway, I now know that you can't have something permanently chaotic. That's a misuse of the term. And also there's a question about the scale. What, if you look at something in detail, how do you know? If you look at a bigger picture, it may not be chaotic, or it appears chaotic, a big enough sample, it may be small. The science is not as well developed as one might think, which is why Mike's talk was so refreshing. John von Neumann, the father figure, or one of the 2 father figures of computing. I'm going to mention here in passing that 2 of the key people, von Neumann and I was going to say Pass, there I go. It's all got 3 key figures, von Neumann, Turing, and Pass. Between them, their obsession was not with generating computers, but with some other biological problem. Von Neumann made a lot of his activity in using cellular automata, following a suggestion by Ulan, that you could use the cellular automata type rules to build a self-structuring, self-contracting. Well, they all wanted basically to generate life, to see the secret of life, to find a way of generating. And these papers by, well, I don't suppose anyone other than Gordon in the room has actually ever seen these papers. They're extraordinarily difficult to read and extraordinarily complicated. But von Neumann spent a vast amount of his dying years formulating a theory by which you could generate a computer system which could reproduce and redevelop itself. Back again to Jascha Reichardt and this obsession with generating life. This is an early model we have that's in the exhibition, which is a self-replicating automata where the rules are on board. And this is a slide of a later model by Thomas Pugiano and Manit Rastogi, where all the intelligence is embedded in each of the cells. A flash of lightning synchronizes them, the little light infrared transmitter which allow them to communicate with their neighbors, and all their intelligence is on board. In other words, here we have a self-replicating, self-building system. It's not, before you get too carried away with the idea, they're quite large cells compared with our human cells, and they're not too smart. This is slightly less intelligent than Bond's slime. Nevertheless, it was a good start. Turing, first of all, he invents the whole concept of computers by mistake whilst trying to solve a particularly unpleasant problem by Hilbert called the, and I can't pronounce it, but it's known as a little shitty problem, but it's the Endfeinchen, somebody will say it for me, Gordon will say it for me. It has a German name about 35 syllables long. And in order to do that, he hypothesized the notion of the existence of a computer. Subsequently, during the war, in an attempt to break the German Enigma U-boat code, he finished up building the world's first computer, which for a long time was concealed by the British Secrets Act. I can only believe because Churchill wanted to take all the credit for having won the war, whereas in fact he was totally dependent on the fact that Alan Turing could read all the messages between Hitler and his U-boat commanders, which was crucial. Sorry? Colossus. And so it's Colossus, that's his, Joe Wilton pointing at me. In fact, I've got two slides up there. One is Enigma, the Enigma code machine on the right. The other is Colossus on the left, which is the subsequent machine. Yes?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. And you have to understand that he only saw this as what he was actually interested in trying to do was to solve the problem of form in nature. This was the primary objective in Turing's work, and most of his written papers and most of the time of his life was spent on looking at the chemical basis of morphogenesis and how this could be simulated. And most of his use and drive to build these ever-increasingly complex machines was generated by this. So the whole history of computing, first of all, came about by accident, and second, it was primarily focused, in the case of both von Neumann and Turing, on solving natural problems rather than mathematical formulations. Now, Richard Dawkins popularized a lot of this work with extraordinary success. I know probably many people in this room have read The Blind Watchmaker and seen the little computer program on the left that allows you to breed things. This was mentioned by Mark Atkinson, who stepped in for William Latham on the very first lecture in the sequence. You can breed things by producing a pseudogenetic code. In this case, you select them by eye on the screen. And from that, you can, the slide on the right shows the way in which the electronic chromosome expresses various genes controlling features of these little creatures which happen on the left. And this wasn't new work, and this particular program by Richard Dawkins wasn't particularly interesting compared with much of the other work, but Dawkins said it loud and clear to the general public and produced a computer program which everyone could understand. I'm a great respecter of that popularization trend in science, that ability to try to bring everybody into understanding something which had been around for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years. People have been fiddling around with this. Nobody, or most people, most gentlemen, knew nothing about it until Dawkins wrote The Blind Watchmaker. I think we greatly undervalue that process of popularization in science. What that was based on was some earlier systems on the right, a fantastic book by Holland called Adaptation in Natural and Artificial Systems, where he very elegantly talks simultaneously about both natural and artificial systems in the same breath, in the same way, in the same structure. And the kind of things that are described in these science. On the left, we have an evolving intelligent vehicle. All it's doing is over millions of iterations evolving a more and more sophisticated, streamlined form by making alterations and testing them. On the right, there is a nozzle of a fire hydrant. What they're trying to do is to maximize the force and velocity of the liquid leaving the fire nozzle, so it will travel the maximum distance of the fire. Number 45 at the bottom, which is the result of a large number of these iterations, is extraordinarily counterintuitive. I don't know whether it occurred to anyone in the room that such a device might be a great deal more efficient than the one at the top, but it is by a considerable factor and significant improvement. So these are using these genetic techniques to solve straightforward technical problems. Here is an interesting structure. On the left is a kind of exercise that we used to set in the first year many years ago, where you were asked to sort of construct little beams with sticks or whatever and put weights on. In this case, two things happen. First of all, the machine has very rapidly, the algorithm, developed a very much more efficient, that is, they're measuring it in terms of supporting the given stresses, but with trying to produce the lightest possible structure to do this. But as we get to stage 6, something rather curious has happened, and it's turned upside down. I just draw temporary because everyone assumes that these processes are uncreative, and I have to say, strictly speaking, I entirely agree. Nevertheless, some things happen in them which gives one pause to think about the nature of one's own creativity. If it suddenly does a little step like number 6, has it cheated? Has it failed to understand the rules? Number 6 is considerably stronger and lighter than 5, or what has happened? I'm not advancing an argument about that, I'm merely just leaving you to think about where any creativity, if there is such a thing, lies in these programs. And again, Margaret Bowden spoke at some detail about it. How do these programs work? Well, you express a problem in the sense of a gene, as on the right, or chromosome if you like, You then have two kinds of crossover. That's the equivalent of mating, sex. Part of one chromosome is exchanged with the other. And you have small mutation, as at the one below, where tiny little errors and changes creep in. So on the left, you see the overall process. A string of genes are tested. Successful ones are picked. They then cross over and mate. Small genetic mutation occurs. They breed, produce a new population as on the bottom of the left-hand slide, and they go round and round the cycle. Very easy to put into a computer. Very, very many iterations can be done very, very fast. Now, we have two different ways of doing evolution and two kinds of selection. Darwin, in Origin of the Species, starts with a chapter on artificial selection, because they only knew about artificial selection when he wrote the book. The only thing they knew about was pigeon breeding and breeding dogs and cats and horses. You pick two horses, you breed a faster one. You pick two pigeons, breed a faster one. You pick two Pekingese, and so on and so forth. That's artificial selection. Darwin then produced the revolution and said, but maybe nature works the same way, and it selects those things which are more successful for one reason or another. Small, tiny changes may give it some small advantage, and as a result, I'm given a massive scale of this, the millions of experiments, we have evolution of the species. But there are also two kinds of evolution, both of which are known in natural science and in artificial science. Convergent evolution. Now, strictly speaking in biology, that means when the same species arises by two different routes. I misuse the term slightly, which is to say that we're trying to home in on a solution. That is, we're trying to close the perfect turbine blade, the perfect structure or whatever, the perfect nozzle for the hose. Examples we've just seen are convergent. But also divergent evolution. When nature gets in at a jam, when the environmental conditions change, it goes into divergent evolution, produces masses of experiments, and from those evolves some new kind of experiment. With these models that we've got and are using, we can use both convergent and divergent evolution. We can both use artificial and natural selection. And those four tools are very powerful. Most of the other speakers, such as Mark Atkinson representing William Latham, talked only about the concept of natural selection, artificial selection. That is, he's picking things off the screen. The biomorphs of Richard Dawkins are artificial selection. You pick yourself off the screen. The things I just showed technically are natural selection. Most of the things that I've done with my students have contained all four techniques simultaneously. And those I seem to me are much more characteristic of the nature of architectural problems, where we need both these techniques, both natural and artificial selection, both convergent and divergent evolution. So everything we've been doing floats around in this map space between these concepts. I've shown this before. This is divergent evolution, just two from the sequence. Starts with the cubes, evolves to this extraordinary kite-like forms, passing on the way through all kinds of other bizarre and diverse forms. You've not seen this before, it's in the exhibition in the book. There's nothing in the initial seeding which describe these emergent forms, but that's divergent evolution. That's letting the thing run wild. This is convergent evolution. This is converging a random description of a column. On the right, there's 100 or more different neoclassical columns, a population of these, either by natural selection, that is optimizing the design, or by artificial selection, that is picking a column. You can evolve a perfect column. So on the left, on the right, sorry, is a perfect James Gibbs column as close as we could measure to his original rules. And on the left is what happens if you use artificial selection and breed a bulldog. And Rick said that. There are some students in the audience. 15 years ago, we tried at the AA to do this, and we failed. We tried to run the column, it just got worse and worse and worse. We've learned a few things over the years, but it took a while. Another technique for learning is looking at neural networks. I'm just spend 2 minutes explaining this concept. Most of the computational systems are involved in our linear computers of one kind or another. We do one thing after another, serial computers. On the right there, you see an experimental neural network which has got an H displayed on the screen at the top right. That's been switched in. The lights at the bottom are, it's learned to respond to that H. What it does is it learns to recognize an H, not dependent upon the particular switching, but on the pattern. So on the left, although the H is now on its side, it's producing an identical response. That is, one of the nice things that happens with these things is that they are pattern, they understand the kind of concept of pattern. Now it's learning on the right T, and on the left it's coping with a T on its side and incomplete information. These systems cope quite well with incomplete, ambiguous, and contradictory information, the characteristics of almost any architectural problem, I would suggest. There is something on the right. Would you like to estimate? Is that a T on its side? Is that an H with an extra bit, or an H with something missing? It's proffering an opinion. And on the left, it's indicating how certain it is that something is what it thinks it is. So these are pattern recognition and learning systems of one kind or another. Genetic algorithms is a software technique. Neural networks is a hardware technique. And then primarily through the work of Igor Alexander in this country. This is the one example of this from Miles Dodson, which is in the exhibition, which is a vast switchable neural network with switches that allow you to interconnect. Your brain consists of all these neurons, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands synaptic connections coming in. The pattern of the firing of those coming in determines the outcome of the neuron, which then passes on that connection. That's how you learn, and these sorts of systems are much closer to things which are natural to us in our understanding. Just in passing mentioned transputers. On the right is a transputer chip, which at the time the photograph was taken was the world's most powerful dense chip. It no longer is. On the left is how you connect these. They're used to talking to a lot of neighbours. Lots to do with communication and networks. The thing in passing to say about that was that chip was the first chip which was so complex it couldn't be designed by hand. It had to be designed by a computer program, which raises an interesting chicken and egg problem, which is how do you design the computer program? The answer is it was done by someone called David Wilson, who was an architect, one of my students from Cambridge. And the fact that it was an architect, I think, is significant. Then we got the question of mapping and coding. These are taken from Lionel March's book. I hope he doesn't mind me robbing his copyright, but I'm doing him credit. His book on the geography of the environment is, I think, greatly underestimated and underrated. On the left, he shows various geometrical transformations. On the right, he shows various geometrical mappings from one system to another. This is all exhaustively and clearly explained in the book. The translations for perspective and everything else are easily expressed in computer code, so that all the kind of deformations or transformations are easily manipulated. This is all relatively trivial. Lionel then treats the matter of coding. On the left, we have Le Corbusier's Maison minimum. At the top is reduced to one line of hexadecimal code. On the right, we have the Seagram building reduced to one line of hexadecimal code and shows how you unpack it. This kind of elegance in the geometrical description is important in terms of the idea of encapsulating these things in DNA. You can cheat, as on the left, and you can exercise distortions on the way out of the system. So that's the beveled Seagram block. And on the right is an extremely well-known building expressed in 10 digits of hexadecimal code. A small prize afterwards, and it will tell you what it is. And when we got involved in, again, the model with the unit in the exhibition, the universal constructor, again, mapping was used to get from each cube in the system has 256 different states. Those mapped to something else. So in this sequence, which I have shown frequently before, these states are achieved by mapping the codes from those states to some geometrical transformation. So dense coding of the information, just as in DNA, and then some output mapping to some state. Just as the DNA, as you grow into a plant, as you grow into your spinach, as you grow into a goat, as you grow into a human being, as you do that, you map the information in that DNA to some sequence of construction. I'm going to talk to you in a moment about the process. And here is a sequence from Marit Rastogi and Thomas Guijana from last year, where they've gone very quickly from a cube to a complex assembly of cubes, which then starts to map into some structural system. If we have time at the end, I'll run that in real time with them. So that starts with nothing more promising than one cube and evolves very rapidly in a series of carefully controlled steps into these forms. Now, I'm using materialization in two senses. I prefer not to use the word materialization, but since some of my students who did the diagrams of this has used the word in the wrong way later on, I'm stuck with this now. So, for the sake of this lecture, that is one kind of materialization, which is into some kind of realizable form. I want to use the word in a more special sense, which is to mean telling it actual matter that you can build and construct, because that is the ultimate objective. The next step in this process is looking at ways in which these models communicate with the outside world. Input devices on the right, output devices on the left, and in the middle are genetic algorithms which control and operate them. I don't know how many of the audience have been at the previous talk. I'm going as fast as I can through this on the assumption that a reasonable number were, or it's in the book. Basically, if I'm going too quickly on some of these points, it's all there and you can refer back to it. What I'm interested in doing this evening is making connections between all these ideas, which is what we haven't done before. So in the middle there's a genetic algorithm organizing an environment which is being sensed by all kinds of environmental antennae and sensors to try to evolve some perfect response. Fractals. Our data systems are self-similar. That is, each part of them reflects in the whole. This is crucial in terms of dealing with the problem of scale. Nature moves very elegantly from molecules to mountains. We have that same problem to solve. The science of fractals is now well known, it's too hackneyed, but I'm using this in passing to make another point, which is there is this curious assumption that if you produce plant-like forms of fractals, you somehow said something about biological processes. Now, I think you have to be very careful about this. Caution element. There are in nature all sorts of processes which are fractal-like, which is a point Mark Adrian Bell made in this course a few lectures back, but not in the algorithmic sense that they're being expressed in these. I would say this is little more than a visual coincidence, but based on some more than coincidental points. So nature in some sense is fractal, but it is not to say that this sort of process tells you anything about a fractal nature. This brings me to the sub-theme of Chamberlain and the Beautiful Llama, or the Lilliput game. Sandy Wilson at Cambridge told me there was a tradition, you see, of putting up slides in pairs which had some sort of visual association. You can't read the captions. On the right is Neville Chamberlain, which is probably someone no one in the audience has heard of, apart from a few people at the front, and on the right is a beautiful llama. This is a magazine called Lilliput Magazine, and had every month or whatever, these pairs of pictures. This is taken from a little compilation of them, where page after page there are these photographic juxtapositions. Now, the reason for raising this is to say that I have been at times got very angry with some people in this building because I feel that they are devaluing some of these techniques. When myself and my research students and my students in the unit talk about the processes we're describing, we mean them properly. We do not mean some superficial visual analogy. There are other people who are quite at liberty, if they wish, to use these things in a different way. They can write words like strange attractor all over their drawings if they wish. They can splatter it with visual analogies between the form of the computer and the way it's going to operate. That's up to them. All I ask is clearly understood that they are using it as a mere visual coincidence or a visual inspiration. We are using it literally, and I want to make that absolutely clear. This is not just a metaphor. We are actually using these inner processes. And I have got very angry at times with people who may be in this room, for which I now apologize, but I hope the reasons for my being so defensive are a lot of energy and effort has gone into trying to. So when I see somebody showing a pattern of a fractal, and then make some totally specious visual connection with something in their project, you can imagine the reason why I get very angry. Two-dimensional symmetry, quickly. We know a lot about two-dimensional. I tried to produce all the operations. Cellular automata, genetic algorithms, mapping, coding, feedback, fractals. Two-dimensional symmetry operations are well understood. They're very well exhausted, having been very complimentary about Lionel March's book, Geometry of the Environment, and I'm going to be incredibly rude and say, dear Lionel, why did you only discuss two-dimensional symmetry on a book on architecture, which some of us thought was a three-dimensional art? The answer is that he does everything by extruding two dimensions into three dimensions. So the three-dimensional symmetry operations that produce things like the very familiar Escher patterns at every known wallpaper in the entire world, which is, raises another issue, which I haven't got time to get into here, which is about the way in which these sorts of concepts manifest themselves through every single culture. They're all two-dimensional. We are in a three-dimensional world, so therefore it was necessary to research three dimensions. Nobody seems to understand what these bloody pink arrows are about in the exhibition. They are absolutely fundamental to the process of understanding three-dimensional symmetry operations in architecture, the fundamental three-dimensional development of these models, and the way in which you do symmetry breaking. Symmetry breaking really is better perhaps stated as being increasingly complex three-dimensional symmetry. 230 of these, and we had to do the whole lot for ourselves because there was no book we could find. There are books of crystallographic tables that tell you about these, which you can look at, but they express them in such abstruse and complex symbolism that it's very difficult to visualize the results. So there's a whole necessity to learn all this information. So that's another, these are all little clues. This is scattered with clues and concepts which are essential to the understanding of the whole. Living systems and the idea of hierarchical organizations is another important thing. I do not believe, and I rubbished my own notion of that little structural system right at the beginning because it was one-dimensional. It was three-dimensional in form, but one-dimensional conceptually because it moved from the concept of a gene into a specific structural element. Miller, this book is inspiration to a number of my students. He identifies in the diagram on the left 17 subsystems common to everything from the cell to the organ, the organism to the group, the organization, society, and the supranational system. There are two levels of elegance in this book at least, one of which is to identify the subsystems, the other is which is to suggest that those appear hierarchically throughout everything from the cell to the organ to the organism. So you build up, you start looking at a cell on the right, through to an organ on the left. I'm skipping some of this stuff. Through to an organism, through to a collection of, and each one of these diagrams in the book contains the same elements. Each one has the same letters on it, and each function is labeled in the same way, showing that you can break things down into subsystems, but they occur at each scale. This, I think, is crucial to our idea of building up a complex architecture, right up to, both in this case, and right up to a supranational system and global systems. All can be viewed, every step in his way can be viewed in the same sense. This, I think, is an important consideration. Now, a couple of reminders about making things. On the left, I have to talk about materials and energy, because I'm conscious that the whole of the thing we've been projecting appears like, to many people, like a very abstract model. This is not intended to be the case at all. When I talk about materialization, in my sense, I intend to build these. When I gave the building, or dedicated a lecture at the beginning to the first building intelligent enough to appreciate the gesture, I meant it. That wasn't an empty rhetoric. That was a serious proposition. The connections in our work between earlier work on things like energy on the left and the tool maker, the tool maker on the right who makes the tool that makes the tool. The person that designs the computer system that designs the transmuter that designs the world. The person that, you have this hierarchy, the Miller hierarchy, but all the way through till we can actually construct these things. This is research into materials. That's one of the things I think is additionally done. This is just to remind me to say there's a lot of work being going on which I think possibly people aren't aware of in the unit, which is about materials and things. The thing on the left is in fact touch-sensitive glass. Across it are etched circuits. When it's working in the exhibition, which is intermittently, you put your hand on it, the glass behind them becomes transparent. That allows you to see through to the third piece of glass, which is on the right, which has diodes at one side showing various states in the circuit, but there's no apparent connection to them. This is making the visible invisible, the invisible visible, trying to show and explain the process. And I said in the previous lecture that all our models in there are either tools of exploration or models of explanation, and many of them are both at the same time. We're trying to make these things explicit and comprehensible to everybody. And so we have applied these to all kinds of specific things like dealing with solar geometry. One specific tiny thing to look at, but this is the intent to try and move all this stuff into the real world. This is not some abstraction. This is not some mathematical game. This is not a series of abstract computer models in the imagination of the computer alone. These are going to be built. These are going to be seen. The CNC, both these pieces of metal were cut from computer programs which Julia and I wrote, which allow you to control, numerical control machines to make things. The point about that is to do with the fact that the computer allows us to access tools in a different kind of way and control them in a different kind of way, which get away from the component-orientated production. And I particularly love that diagram of Buttons to Fuller on the left, where you've never seen it before, he suggests you could roof Manhattan with matchsticks. The point being that you take a tenseggrity mouse in the right. The point about tenseggrity structure is that you minimize the compression, because obviously a strutting compression is going to follow by buckling, so you make the compression members as short as possible. Tensile members, it doesn't matter how long they were. They only discovered that after Hooke, interestingly enough, but that's a sidetrack. Before that, they thought the longer a rope was, the weaker it was. That was obviously partly true, because you're self-weight. Anyway, he's trying to minimize the compression. So you take a magnifying glass, as in the middle of the stride on the left, and find that each strut is made of little tensegony struts, and again, recursively. But that again is a model and a paradigm of nature. We are built as tensegony structures. The action is space through, you go right through your hand. It's all to do with the tensegony, the tension forces between the attraction forces, between the atoms and the fields and the neutrons, and the space that they are making for themselves. And that concept, again, I think is a key to how to change the scale of these things. Our own models are now based on close-packing spherical geometry. It's just convenient. Cubes are a nuisance. They have 26 neighbours of three different sorts: edge neighbours, face neighbours, vertex neighbours. 26 neighbours, far too many to talk to. The fact they're all different is a pain. Spheres, close-packed, have 12 neighbours, which is a nice, elegant number. They're all equidistant. So they're isospatial, isotropic, isomorphic, isometric, equal measure, equal dimension, equal kind, equal orientation, doesn't matter. So we have a homogeneous spatial model, isospatial model. And as it happens, and this is entirely coincidence, that my original seed from 30 years ago, which was my starting point on the left, actually has the same geometrical configuration as the seed on the right, which is the one-stage expansion of that close-packing structure. It's coincidence, but it's not. I'll work out that later. And I want to talk about this though instead, which is false. Everybody always assumes that when you look at these things, everything is already known. It's just not the case. Simply as simple as piling ball bearings together, there is more to be seen. In this case, Nicola Lefebvre discovered that if you produce a fault, on the left a close packing ball bearing, on the right is the next layer which has, you can see, I'm sure, a shadow line across it, a dislocation in the system. You pile the next level on top, and on the left, magically the fault disappears, it corrects itself. And on the right, it reappears. There is self-replicating information in a physical, natural system, not in an electronic system. Here you can see it in the computer model. Model exactly how these faults replicate each other, and it's free. Oh, this is a casting of it, and I've shown this many times before. I mention this simply because I like the idea that the thing on the right is my ancestor. The idea that the fundamental information inside us is nothing more than the replication of faults in clay, I find a nice hanging notion. And Cairn Smith, who's mentioned in Dawkins' book, he talks about the idea of replication in mineral systems as being the origin. The question is, how did DNA evolve? We understand that. There's so many of these unanswered questions. And here is one potential. On the right there is an evolving three-dimensional fault line model where the fault starts to replicate and gains in consistency as it replicates. There is one possible model. And again, there is discussion about giving this notion back into the natural sciences and to say, look, here is a model by which at least we don't have to say that this is the origin of life. We don't have to say this is how DNA evolved. All we have to say is, look, we have a model of something which actually evolves and replicates its own faults, and it's nothing more than a set of tracking sphere. It's so simple. Now I move to the conceptual model of this. This is the model constructed by Manet Rastogi with Thomas Fujal, particularly with Manet, which is a compilation of all the thinking of the unit. On the left, you see little pile of spheres. There are white ones which are environment and blue ones which are structure. They're being driven at the top by two cellular automata. The 2D cellular automata are driving the rules of the 3D cellular automata. And between the structure and the environment, it is negotiating a surface, which is the yellow surface that you can see developing. So the negotiations over the development of the surface are entirely to do with the negotiation between these cells, which are multi-state cellular systems. Now, I got at some point to come clean about something. Maybe I'll do it now. In all these cases, what I've always said is that the architect embodies his generic concept in a genetic language to make a seed which is then developed in these computer programs by modeling the development of that thing inside an environment, and that is how his architectural concept is going to develop. Now that gives the architect a very strong role in one sense, and gives the client and user a very strong, the environment a very strong role in another sense. I like that change, but the temptation was that wasn't enough. I mean, if you happen to be religious, then you don't have a problem with this. I'm not, so I cannot attribute the forms I see in front of me in this room to some deity. Therefore, I have a problem. So I thought, well, I have to be able to do the architecture equivalent, which is to evolve these things out of a primeval soup. And what I'm going to say is that what I've been doing over the last few years, quietly in the background, is trying to get these models to run with no seed and no rules, no input. All I do as the architect is to set up the situation. I set up the situation in which it might happen and then see if the whole thing cannot evolve itself. And increasingly, some of the models you're seeing, you'll find there's increasingly a hands-off tendency as gradually you begin to realize that these things are capable of learning and developing their own rules, their own emergent properties, their own internal conceptual behaviors, their own internal architectures. So just as you thought I'd given you this role of immortality, I take it away. Instead, I offer an option of deification by creating an environment in which a whole new experience might happen. These are slides explaining the model which is currently running on the internet. And anyone in the room who's trying to log in and had difficulty, I apologize. We've had all kinds of problems. I'm sure if you were there at the Big Bang, there were a few glitches, and they would say, hang on, you can't do it, you can't do it. And a little bit of a problem. So we have had some difficulties, but it is now running, or I'm reassured for the third or fourth time that it's now running. These are diagrams of the system. The model was primarily built by Marat Rastogi in collaboration with Peter Graham, from a certain extent from Ulster, and Patrick Janssen. Patrick did the diagrams on the left explaining this. This is fundamentally, that describes the whole thing. In the middle is a chromosome pool of genes coming in from all over the world. By cellular division and developing, it develops these into systems, which are then tested in an environment and are more or less successful, as a result of which it is more or less probable that the genes in that dominant chromosome pool might or might not get picked again. On the left, you can see the elements of the model. The far right of the, on the right. The far right of the right is the cellular structure growing. The bottom left is a map of the search space, and on the top left is what they call materialization, or I would call visualization. So here you see it step by step. Here you see the elements of cellular growth as this thing develops and develops a cellular structure. And on the right, you can see that. Here you see the problem of the genetic search space. Where are you looking? How do we know where we're looking for? Increasingly, there is thinking coming out of some of the students in the unit about the idea in which there are sort of strange attractors in this space, which will make some things more or less likely to be successful in productive areas. And then materialization by going through this position structure of cellular division and mapping. Now, that's how the central chromosomal algorithm works. It's simply a description of the processes. Almost all these processes require everything I've mentioned this evening. They rely on the cellular autonomy, the genetic algorithms, the mapping, the coding, the whole thing, and more. This is just an overview of all the little bits in the jigsaw and how they come together. And what I think I'd like to do is ask, what do you think you can manage to run from back there? Can we run the spheres model, the surface model, and that, can we?
Yes.
Okay, right, we're going to just try and run, to finish, I'm stopping talking, try and run two or three of these things live. We try the spheres one first.
Can I do one before that?
Yes, do one. Okay. Well, how long does it take? Just a minute. And a moment. Big bangs, a big slip. I think while they're just fixing that, what I'm going to do, if you wouldn't mind, while I'm... Okay, so at the top you see the chromosome. You have environmental messages coming in, and you have genetic messages coming in from all over the world. You can download this model to any machine. Anyone who's got a machine can download it and run their own set. So the thing self-replicates. We have a complete self-replicating architectural generic model. On the bottom left, you see this, the mapping of this, the genetic search space. This is a simulation of the growth of one of these structures, which is, I think, the same one that's running in the exhibition space. So it's growing according to internal rules about the logic of the connection between the cells, transition rules, a three-dimensional cellular automata placed back in space, influenced by external information about the environment. We treat the environment and the structure as the same thing at the moment. Now the dross, in our own private little vocabulary, if you think about this wood, actually what you can see and touch is what's left over after the cellular activity. You, the physicality of you, is the bit left over after the cellular activity and eating the beef burger. This is what's left over after that cellular activity. This is the residual stuff, which we're the carapace. That's the thing. Gradually trying to mutate. Have we got one more? There's a question mark on this one.
No.
Yes?
No.
No. Okay, we haven't got one more. Right, we are going to see the last one. Okay, right. Okay, I just would like to end, and if I might, would you mind if I just read the last paragraph from the book again? Really just try and summarize all of it. Sort of read it, but it kind of condenses the whole thing into a few sentences. An evolutionary architecture will exhibit metabolism. It will maintain stability with the environment by negative feedback and promote evolution by employing positive feedback. It will conserve information whilst using the processes of autopoiesis, autocatalysis, and emergent behaviour to generate new forms and structures. Not a static picture, but a dynamic picture of becoming and unfolding. A direct analogy with the natural world. And the connection, of course, with what Gordon was saying. And also, Mark, I think that we, as a unit, maybe underplay the kind of transmission of social information. And I particularly enjoyed Mark's talk on Tuesday and that contribution to an understanding about other kinds of ways in which other sorts of information travel in these systems. Our architecture will derive order from its environment and be controlled by a symbiotic relationship with its inhabitants in that environment. It knows the coded instructions for its own development and is thus in a limited sense conscious. It can anticipate the outcome of its actions and can thus be said to have some intelligence. All the parts of the model cooperate, and in that sense it can be considered as an organism. But it will only fully exist as such if it is a member of an evolving system of organisms interacting with each other as well as with the environment. Our new architecture will emerge on the very edge of chaos where all living things emerge, and it would inevitably share some characteristics of primitive life form. And from this order, from this chaos, will emerge order. From this chaos will emerge order. Order not particular, not peculiar, not odd or contrived, but order generic, typical, natural, fundamental, and inevitable, the order of life. I will take questions. You have
try to scientificize a point which I think you made very clearly. Would you agree that architecture is the multidisciplinary pragmatics and semantics syntax which may emerge from merely theoretical thinking?
I repeat very clearly my own view on this, which is that we are too dependent on derived science from other areas, and we are not sufficiently confident to say that we have things speculate from our own experience. That in itself is also a science, and I think we underrate our ability to contribute something. I would also like to say that we've had a very distinguished set of visitors in this, and what all of them say is how much they enjoyed this audience, and the questions they got, and the questions they got at the bar, and the conversations at the restaurant afterwards, and so on. They are very happy to come into this environment to exchange ideas amongst each other, which they probably can't do anywhere else. I would like to promote the notion of the AA as a forum for discussing ideas that are particularly to do with these issues, and the idea of generative systems is one particularly obvious one. Creative systems is another. Information transfer in societies, and I mean, one could have a whole galaxy of suggestions. And I think the AA actually underrates, actually the AA probably doesn't do it, but architecture as a discipline, I think, underrates its ability to make a serious contribution in all these disciplines.
Thank you.
Mike.
I'd like to emphasize something that you said. I think that the three-dimensional symmetry is just so nothing real, so weird, and yet I really do think they're as fundamental as anything that we've got. They are the key. They are not only such a state that they don't take the form out of the form, but they almost express the form inside the form. They are all the possibilities that they are. And they don't seem very exciting or sexy or prepossessing like the wires and perspex. But I think they really are the cutting point of this study.
Well, the point I'd like to make about that is that although there are some books of architectural theory that mention the existence of these groups, I'm not aware of any book that actually illustrates any of them. Lionel March, there's another associated book from Cambridge which shows some kind of crystallographic type diagrams, which is the closest I've come across. But the cultural overtone is all important. If you look at those plane symmetry groups that are illustrated with the Escher, it is fascinating. Owen Jones's book, which is the book from which Frank Lloyd Wright traced all the drawings he took to Sullivan's office in order to get his first job. That book is full of extraordinarily rich examples of these symmetry. There are 17 known plane symmetry groups, and every known civilization found all 17, yet nevertheless they have individual characteristics of that culture. There is no way you would confuse, shall we say, one of these symmetry groups turning up in an Islamic culture with one turning up in a Central European culture. But they enjoy and entail the same mathematical symmetry operations, yet at the same time they have their unique individual local characteristics. This idea is very important to me. And so any student in the room who's looking for a topic for a general studies essay, the thing we think we would love to know about is, would somebody like to look at examples of cross-cultural referencing in three-dimensional symmetry groups? Because the examples of things like the Alhambra Palace and stuff are exquisite and totally under-researched. Gordon.
Might I say that it's what we're looking for is a peaceful functor between categories, not simply a function or mapping between sets. And what architecture gives, and why one should make metaphors and other science is just that we're not dealing with sets of things, but with objects in categories. And in several categories there is a identity object, identity operator, which may be regarded as frog-like or cat-like or whatever. And there are morphisms between them which relate them. And the functor is something that maps one category onto the other.
Yes, I mean, I think we've done ourselves a disservice by not paying more attention to this in the way in which the unit so far projected its work. Just for the record, the current unit, I'm very excited about the kind of ideas that are coming up with them, are moving as much more into the idea of them in the realm of physical materialization. It's materialization and visualization, so materialization and physicality. And one of the things that we've got to be very careful to pay a lot of attention to in there is this point that Gordon's was making, which we've been aware of, but have really not done enough with. I think that's just to do with, at times, in order to make it possible to explain what they're doing, I'm certainly guilty of over-exaggerating one particular thing at one moment in order to focus it up sharply. The diversity of students I've got actually makes that a nonsense right from the start. There's a diversity of views and opinions come in. The way the unit operates, it does not have a clear goal at all. It's dead reckoning. We have a kind of rough wake behind us. We think we're going roughly in some direction, but everybody is free to go alongside where they want. And I love the maximum conceivable diversity of approach and opinion. Every bit of that. And some of the most unpromising, unlikely things have turned out to be just pure gold. It's very difficult to tell in advance whether an idea, you have a hunch sometimes. Sometimes the hunch is right, every so often you get it wrong. How do you know? And that's a problem like grants in science. It's hopeless because they get that, they apply for grants on the basis of somebody's expectation they can do it. In order to do that, you have to describe a doable problem with a doable methodology. But if you could do that, then you've already done it. So that, sorry.
There's a point I wanted to follow up on Gordon's statement. In one inflammatory talk, John, you went incandescent at one point about this issue of fractal leaf drawings, and you got extremely angry with the idea of simply using these processes as a metaphor. Would you concede that it might well be that somebody farther up or some being farther up the abstract hierarchy would get extremely annoyed with your attempts to try to close these things in a physical form, whereas in fact we are talking about very abstract, trying to use logic or mathematics or whatever it is that our brains have given us to understand these forms. It's not necessary.
That's a very beautiful point.
In reality.
This is George Mallam today. That's a very elegant point. What I was trying to say, that Atlas was really to say, everyone do what they like. Everyone's free agent. But I do wish they would be clear what it is they're doing. So if somebody, at least I'm trying to be clear about it, and I hope whoever's up there who's got a broader view than me, at least think, well, poor little chap, he's just jogging away down there. At least it's clear in its own sense. It's this borrowing and stealing and transferring of ideas as if they contain a lot more than they do when it's not really there. That is what anyone can do what they like with evidence, a free world. But I do wish it would be clear at what level they're operating, whether it's literal, whether it's a metaphor, whether it's an analogy, whether it's inspiration, and trying to be specific about that. That's all I ask. Otherwise, it devalues an intellectual currency.
No, I understand that. I think.
And I entirely take the point. There's probably somebody else who could do the same game on.
No, I'm trying to get at the point of
and if you know who they are, could we invite them to lecture?
I'm trying to get at the idea of abstraction as such, and building science, not necessarily concerned with the physical world, but with the world of ideas, which have their own replicatory processes. And maybe the architecture is connected to that, saying there's molecules and DNA are connected to it, but it's not ultimately about what's doing.
Gustav.
Yes, I'd just like to sound maybe a slightly warning note against directly jumping from the computer as such, the computer system possibilities and their expression in graphics and shapes, whatever. To jump from that to nature, I would say there are certain fundamental breaches between what we have got at the moment in computers and what nature is. We can make analogies, but I just want to suggest that there is a danger in saying we've got it, because I believe deep down we haven't. The differences are so fundamental, and then when we see these quite beautiful developments of form which we have through the computer, I think we should again have another warning note. What we see is what we know. we are creating images which we have seen, for example, in futurism or in models, mathematical models 100 years ago or more. And so we are generating forms through the computer which are in fact not as revolutionary, not as complex as we would like perhaps to think. So on these two planes, I suggest we should have considerable caution and reflect again and again.
I take that criticism very much to heart. First of all, there was an element of self-mockery in the showing of the Disney Sorcerer's Apprentice at the beginning. But also in passing, isn't it wonderful how good animation was before they used computers to do it? So there was an element of self-criticism implied in that, that one can get carried away with, and one actually doesn't know what was doing. There is another level to this, which is that even the most hard-nosed sort of Darwinians like Dawkins, they mock all the things that Sheldrake was talking about last night, like the elan, the vitalism, the intellect, the idea that you have to have some will to life and all that. They mock all that. But then, when they actually write, nevertheless, they inadvertently, Dawkins, one of his best-known books, his first book, is called The Selfish Gene. Now, in order to talk about selfish gene, you're immediately imbuing this gene with anthropomorphic symbolism. I mean, how can a gene be selfish? This is a human concept. It's a concept we brought in and applied. So they're subject to the same kind of criticism. I am sensitive to this issue, and I think that it's very nice to hear someone publicly voice these concerns, and we perhaps in an attempt to try to be clear and enthusiastic about what we're doing, not necessarily always sufficiently dwell on some of the negative side of the problems. And I do entirely understand that to talk of nature as a computer, any reductionist position, basically the very word, why reduce ourselves to mere mark? Doesn't tell you anything. I agree.
Again, also the computer, as you showed us clearly, is wartime here in England, wartime Britain, and wartime America. The computer, these enormous room-filled computers, were only developed to develop the atom bomb in great secrecy. Not only, but this is the origin of the American computer, Neumann.
But the delightful bit, the lovely bit of the whole thing was that the ENIAC, the world's actually was finished too late. It was supposed to compute the trajectory of shells, and it was actually finished too late with the slightest bit of use in war, which is the bit that Americans never tell you.
Ma'am, please, do not take computer as simply the Turing environment made me notorious. That's not the only kind of computer. There are many kinds of computers. There are computers made out of animals. There are computers made out of chemical messes, as George would be the first to say, since he got what's nitrogen peroxide up in there. And when they blew up, they did. And the computer is something which is not to be bounded as a black box with input and an output, accepting quite an arbitrary. The computer is a much broader idea, and computation, which is brought in by John and Julia, is, and the whole unit, is something to do with a regulation. And if you have a process, if you have a building site, if you have any tangible thing, then you may attach to it something something which was almost amorphous with certain conditions, those of life, as demonstrated on the slides, vitality, and it's not biological of necessity, it is of any kind which maintains certain principles, and this, I think, was called computation.
I think there's a couple more questions here. If you take those two, maybe that's it. The gentleman with the stripe shirt.
If we assume that in the morphogenetic process, the fundamental ingredient is imagination, and we all know that of the greatest scientists saying that imagination is more important than knowledge. And how do you make that input in your method? And because information and information is easy to get it in the computers. And seeing your forms, even though I am a religious person, I find a problem. And they might appeal hard and difficult in RAM and hard disk terms, but in brain terms it might be a different case. My question is, how do you input that imagination?
Right, well, there were two stages to the answer to that question. The first one was that if you take the simpler version of our model, where we're trying to encapsulate people's generic ideas, the generating first initial spark in the thing, that's very simple. That is, you basically try and capture that extraordinary essence, the sort of essence by which you can tell every individual architect's work as being their own, every individuality, that you can capture that. And in the exhibition, you can see that in the Walter Siegel model and the Cedric Price model. They're very limited models, Energy by Erector, 3 models in there, but that's clearly visible. That the whole of their kind of thinking is encapsulated in some way in the working of the process, and therefore they are, in that sense, immortal because this can go on indefinitely. The other twist to this was towards the end when I said, but nevertheless, I think we can dispense with that too. Now this is the more problematic point, it's probably the one that's giving you the problem. That is to say that one takes it even a step further back and says that the creative bit is setting up the situation in which something could happen. Now, you might say, well, that's not coloured by any of its individuality or anything else. To which I have two answers. One is, well, it would probably be better if it wasn't. That is, Buckminster Fuller had a nice phrase, which was that the house should be muted like a violin at 0. A violin doesn't make any noise till you play it. Why should a building live in until you do something with it? That's one argument. The other argument is to say that nevertheless it's actually impossible to in any way repress people's individuality. It comes through so strongly. Another example of that is the way in which in the most technical kind of work, nevertheless you can see immediately which student, which kind of ideas contributed to it. So I think that these things are impossible to lose on the one hand. On the other part of it is that there is a certain argument that suggests that it might be a good thing if we could, and change the balance in favour of the users and participation in the process. I'm conscious of the time and we need the lecture. There's one more speaker, some of the back.
There's one at the back.
Just a very prosaic point in terms of concern about other computers. When Kubrick did his chemical experiments and the Adaptation experiments with Russell, they were essentially using chemical reactions as 3-dimensional, massively parallel computers. And a lot of experiments, which also maybe later recognized as being using natural objects.
Well, I think we should thank the audience for being so patient for 3.5 weeks.
Okay, well, first of all, I would like to thank the audience. But mostly, I'd like to thank John for this talk, for the series of talks, and to congratulate him and Julia on the exhibition. Thank you very much.
תני לי רגע שוט אחד. שוט אחד. נו.
קרצייתה.
תמי, תחזיקי לה רגע את הידיים.
מיקי.
תמי, צבעת שיער לשחור, לא?
הנה, הוא מצלם אותי.
מה את עושה? רגע. תמי, תגידי מילה חגיגית לכבוד האירוע. יש.
Sie fangen am 5. April an.
לחיי... עכשיו?
The talk is going to be in 3 parts. I'm going to briefly read a prepared statement for the first few minutes, if you'll bear with that. Then I'm going to do a lightning tour of the content of the exhibition, explaining how that reflects back on the theoretical proposition that I've made in the opening statement. And then I'm going to conclude by reading another brief statement from the book, which concludes this and tries to explain what it is that we're really trying to achieve in the long term. At 7 o'clock, there will be a launch of the internet model in here, by which time I hope you'll have cleared all the chairs. And at that time, we'll also do all the facts. So at the moment, I just intend to talk. And there is an associated series of lectures on the generative process with a series of distinguished visitors. I'd also be glad if you could kindly leave any questions to the end. I would normally love to take questions in a lecture, that's part of the interactive process. But if you take questions tonight, I fear we may never get to the opening or the drink or anything else. And so if you could hold questions till after the final lecture, where I'm going to make a much more formal statement about the theoretical position, which I'm only going to hint at in outline tonight. The perfection and variety of natural forms is a result of complex morphogenetic processes and the relentless experimentation of evolution. By means of profligate prototyping and ruthless rejection of flawed experiments, nature has evolved a rich biodiversity of interdependent species of plants and animals in metabolic balance with their environments. Whilst vernacular architecture and some aspects of architecture might occasionally share some of these characteristics, the vast majority of our contemporary art environment certainly does not. Now, you would have guessed from the title of the book and the exhibition that it is clearly our proposition that we can in some way use these evolutionary processes. But we're very sadly reminded by the recent earthquake in Japan that there are very good reasons why we do not usually evolve buildings by practical experiment. Because unlike the natural process of which we are part, we are not prepared to tolerate the human suffering and other costs caused by failure. It may seem unjust that structural weakness tested by shaking a building to death is one of the few crimes against nature which are so dramatically exposed. There are, I would suggest, many far more serious social and environmental flaws in architecture which go largely unpunished. The demolition of Pruitt-Igoe and Ronan Point flats remain isolated examples of human attempts to eliminate flawed experiments. Ships, though, have not had such good fortune to receive such lenient treatment meted out to buildings. To quote Joseph Conrad, "Of all the living creatures upon land and sea, it is ships alone that cannot be taken in by barren pretences, that will not put up with bad art from their masters." Nautical charts are densely marked with a location of wrecks giving some indication of the vast extent of bad art and barren pretense. That's at sea. Land indication. The Mary Rose, much loved by Prince Charles, has been raised from the seabed and is currently the subject of an architectural competition to house it in Portsmouth. I hope the Prince does not miss the delicious irony of building a museum to celebrate the disastrous folly of his royal predecessors. The Mary Rose is the pride of the fleet of Henry VIII, the design reflecting pompous royal taste rather than the demands of the sea. And it was appropriately humbled by rolling over and sinking whilst the king watched from the shore. If the National Gallery extension had been a ship, perhaps it too would have rolled over and sunk on its maiden voyage. The frequent collapse during construction of medieval cathedrals was possibly the last time that architecture has attempted to emulate the evolutionary processes of nature. Human sacrifice for divine objectives has now gone out of fashion. Martyrdom is now demanded for political objectives. Nevertheless, it is my thesis that we can only achieve in our built environment some of the characteristics that we admire in the natural environment by emulating some of the processes by which nature achieves her designs. Architecture in the past has frequently drawn inspiration from nature, previously from its forms and structures, but more recently the inspiration has been the inner logic of the natural form-generating processes. The inner processes of interest us here include the metabolic balance that nature achieves, the symbiotic cooperation and behaviour, the cooperative behaviour, the fundamental morphogenetic processes, the economy of the genetic coding, and the process of evolution itself. The awesome creative power of natural evolution is emulated by creating virtual architectural models which respond to changing environments. Successful developments are encouraged and evolved. Architecture is considered as a form of artificial life, subject, like the natural world, to principles of morphogenesis, genetic coding, replication, and selection. So how would we do this? The evolutionary model requires an architectural concept to be described in a genetic code. The code is mutated and developed by a computer program into a series of models in response to a simulated environment. The models are then evaluated in that environment, and the code of successful models used to reiterate the cycle until a particular stage of development is selected for prototyping in the real world. In order to achieve the evolutionary model, it is necessary to define the genetic code, the rules for developing the code, mapping of the code to a virtual model, the nature of the environment, the development of the model, and most importantly, the criteria for selection. What I'm going to do now is take you on a very fast tour, very informally, through the exhibition, trying to draw attention as we go to some of the key points that are necessary in order for us to try and establish this model. I'm going to start, partly to amuse some of my colleagues who will have seen these a very, very long time ago, partly for nostalgic reasons, and partly because it's the simplest place. This is the Architectural Association some 30 years ago. It was hard work. You had to define every line, you had to write computer programs of immense length, there were no nice graphics packages, and at the end you needed something rather like a tank to draw it. Painful and tedious, it made me realize that there must be more efficient ways of using this potentially extremely powerful device. I managed to get some drawings out, at least well enough to pass, but they were achieved, and it seemed to me more labor than it might have taken to put the data in. Being intrinsically lazy, this seemed to me quite the wrong way around for the process. It seemed to me the computer was supposed to be aiding me, not me the computer. So I decided to try and cut corners. What I was actually doing was a simple little structural system with some folding plates. These simple two elements are fitted together in a variety of forms. So what I did was, instead of putting all the data in, I developed a seed. And on the left there is a photograph of the original seed. What it is the minimum possible configuration of those structural units in every possible orientation in space, such that they close. And embedded in there are, by definition, the rules for making this geometry and the rules for combining and developing it. And on the right, you see very early computer experiments at Cambridge with still a circular cathode ray screen. There were still lights on the computer, just like in the movies. There really were computers like that once. And that's where it all started. That was the first seed. We mutated the seed. The idea was it was expressed, the file on the right is merely to show the genetic code. I don't know if I can make this now. Up there is the very first time we wrote a little bit of genetic code. That was a very dense attempt to express form and geometry and orientation in a very tightly coded manner. And on the left is the idea that instead of putting all the data into the system here, you just put a seed in, and then you had a cultivation program, and you made the machine do the work. And then you put some output, and it got some graphics. Well, that sounded very simple, and it's taken me 30 years to get much further. It started on the left, you can see it growing. There at the top left is the computer codified. That's how that seed looked. That little silver model looks when represented in the computer, looks like that. Here you see it growing. Here you see a different seed growing in a different way. There were a series of automatic commands which allowed one to develop and mutate this seed. The screen was only capable of showing a very small number of units. These slides weren't just taken to make it easy to see what's happening. There were, in fact, typically by this time 2 to 5, maybe 10,000 of these little units in a model as it grew and developed. The important point to me was I hadn't had to go to the trouble of inputting 10,000 bits of data. I'd only input the data, the 32 or whatever it was, for the initial seed, and the computer had done the rest. And so these mutated and developed, and from that, the models are, these are just simple representations again of the seeds, so you can see what's happening. These forms are now being generated, in this case they're being modeled physically, but they were being modeled virtually in the computer as a result of a simple rule-based system that allowed them to grow and develop. So on the left you see a structure which has been developed by the computer, and on the right there's a sort of schematic diagram showing different strategies the computer could have adopted to build this very simple shed-like space. And there was the first building which I designed, which wasn't really designed by me at all. I must at this point clarify what I mean by this. I, as the architect, had designed the seed. I had conceptualized the seed and put the seed into the system. I had effectively, artificially, virtually inseminated it. And implicit in that were the rules for its development, just as there are in DNA. The thing that resulted was, to a certain extent, out of my control. It was dependent to those rules to a varying extent. And I'll have to keep on re-clarifying this point during the evening. Now, one of the first, and jumping now in both time and space, to Walter Siegel, because this raises two other points. First of all, that model was restricted to a rather kind of curious Buckminster Fuller-like space frame geometry, and therefore very limited usefulness. And it was a kind of one-off specific kind of program. You could produce lots of varieties, but only on that one thing. The question that had arisen in my mind was, could one generalize this? And there were two other approaches that occurred in the interim. One was Walter Siegel. If you're not familiar, these are Walter Siegel's houses built by self-builders, and he wanted them to design their own buildings. So he had this little simple modeling kit built where the panel system that he used, the module, was easily manipulable. The problem was it still needed help. So we made a kit for Walter Siegel. On the left is a box of kitted parts. This is in the exhibition. On the right you see little loops, but you may be able to just detect electronic components bristling out of them. And those electronic components allowed that component to be read when it was plugged into a baseboard. There were little doors and windows, all of which were machine readable. So on the right there is a baseboard, and on the left you see this being assembled. You simply plug the parts into the model base, and there up comes the plan on the screen. So anybody, any potential self-builder who knows nothing about architecture, and more importantly in this case, nothing about computers, notice there are no digitizing tablets, no mice and no keyboards. What you do is it's a totally instinctive system. You put in panels where you want them, and they come up on the computer screen. Anyone who can build a model of a house, which most children can manage to build a model of their house. The computer then reads it, prints out the plan, produces all the working drawings, produces the schedule, tells them what it will cost, and helps them redesign it if they want to improve it. Although there's the structural drawings coming out for that particular plan on the left, and of course the schedules of costs. And a later what-if model where we got this, and a colleague, Stephen Brown, maybe here, developed this as a sort of teaching aid to try to encourage people to play with computers. Because at that time, this is I've forgotten now, this is Siegel, 1982, we're talking about 12 years ago when we started this, just about 14 years ago. At that time, there was a tendency to say, well, computers, they could model things and help to improve your design, which applied as other centres of research in the United Kingdom, that you go to student crits, and of course they would pin up piles of drawings on the wall, and they would say, oh, they optimise this window design on the basis of the computer feedback, thereby producing huge sheets of paper feedback covered with information, and as a result of which they had moved the window slightly. Any conversation about the fact that the design was fundamentally ill-conceived is completely impossible in such a climate. But the question was how, and of course it laboured for weeks, of course, to change the data to do this. So this little machine just allowed you to play around with changing thermal insulation and daylighting and so on, and gave you a very quick response. So this raises two different issues. First of all, we're still talking about embedding rules. It's still a limited system, in this case a very simple, very panel grid system, so we're not getting very far in our attempts to generalize. But it does raise some other issues, which are different forms of user interaction and the notion of user participation. And participation becomes more and more important to me. It was the subject of my thesis at the AA, but for a long time I couldn't quite see how to do it. Participation with something like this, where the designer was also the builder, seemed to me perfectly self-evident and understandable and obvious. when it comes to something like a city, or when it comes to something like judging an opera house, we're in deep trouble. How do we democratize architecture without reducing it to a vulgar vote? I'll come back to this point. Other project round at this time was for Cedric Price. This is the generator. He approached Julia, as my wife and I, asking us to produce a computer program that would help rearrange them. If you're not familiar with this site, this is a gross simplification of the plan. It's a grid, but in Cedric's case it's a more sophisticated and bent grid. At this early stage of the computer program, it didn't show that. And it has little single, double, and triple cubes that could be rearranged on the site. This is the earliest 2 slides I could find of it. And the idea was that there was a crane permanently on site that would rearrange these cabins to accommodate changing user requirements, changing appetites in Cedric's terminology. Now, these very early drawings posed this problem, which were that this was easy enough to do, but how would we know where the crane driver had put the bits? So since we were playing around with this sort of model, we suggested to Cedric that we should embed electronics in every single part of the structure. So in this case, every single structural element in that gridded forest was going to contain a microprocessor chip. This was 1980. And in 1980, they just came on the market. You can see the vintage from the competitor. Actually, if you don't, this is probably, for many people in the audience, this thing was called affectionately a PET and was the breakthrough. The idea that you could actually buy at a reasonable price a cheap microprocessor, and it caused a minor revolution. And my friend here, Paul Case, in the front row, was responsible for a brilliant suggestion, because it had absolutely awful graphics. All you had to do was attach it to a plotter, because it had a laboratory-type connector, and you could get the plotter to produce a high-resolution line drawing. So those previous drawings there have come off nothing more sophisticated than that. So by rearranging these parts, you could interact with this model. But it became more than that, because it meant you could tell where the crane driver had put things. It gave you a processor, but we realized there was excess processing power. In effect, the building was capable of computing its own organization. It was, in fact, a very complex, reconfigurable array processor, in the jargon, of a mammoth scale. And this was an embarrassment, because there was much more computing power than we needed. And so Gordon Pass, in his early Musicolor experiments, and Gordon's long been an inspiration to myself and our whole unit here, had the notion that a music machine should become bored. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So he suggested the computer should become bored. And if it became bored, what it would do was whimsically and arbitrarily suggest rearrangements to the configuration of the site. Now that is not a facetious suggestion, because A, it would encourage people to understand that the site was reconfigurable. People aren't used to moving buildings around in the middle of the night. And the other thing was that it was a basis for beginning to learn and experiment. If people themselves couldn't be bothered to experiment with it, the building would experiment with itself and see if it could find a better way of arranging itself. This produced some quite entertaining, some quite entertaining headlines at the time from variant saying, so this thing got dubbed an intelligent building. It wasn't all that intelligent, but at least it was more intelligent than what are normally now called intelligent buildings, which simply have facilities for computers. But it got bored, and the idea was this was the beginning of trying to get buildings to learn how to organize themselves better. I had suggested this with my original project at the AA, but everyone just laughed at me, so I tended to put that in the story. These are the first attempts to embed real intelligence into cells. Now, cellular automata is a key technique used by the unit. And I'm going to delay talking about that because we have some experts coming in this series. Mike Lesser is one of the world's leading authorities, and we'll return to this topic in more detail. For the moment, all I need to say for this lecture is a cellular automata is something where the state of any one cell at any one moment is dependent upon the state of its neighbours and what are called transition rules. So depending on what's round it and what they're doing, this thing does something different. That's the sense of it. And it works on a clock basis, and it's a subject of an enormous field of study, and particularly von Neumann, the father figure of computing in America, spent most of his life working on self-replicating automata. This particular automata is alarming because it had the intention that it could self-replicate itself, That is, these cells, although they are extremely unintelligent, they would at least have the intelligence to understand the rules of their own self-reproduction. So this was, in fact, potentially a working model of a self-reproducing machine. We followed that with a few other experiments, like intelligent beer mats. These are just input devices other than keyboards and digitizers. Well, it's simple enough. You know, in a pub, you fiddle with beer mats, and you talk to your client, and like dining hall, and you give them around, you have a few drinks, and it gets better, and then the following morning, you had a brilliant idea, if you remember what it was. Well, in this case, it has a handy little lead that sneaks off to your pocket from the beer mat. The standard circuit board, I have to tell you, is exactly the size of a Guinness mat, so this is not coincidence. By the far side there, we have a much more sophisticated device where we've got really quite complex geometry. And in the plotter, you can just make out it's drawing a self-portrait of the arrangement of these units. As you turn them over, it's a very intuitive device. If you've never played with one of these, it's most extraordinary. Children love it because they just see immediately, understand what's happening. You turn it over, they see it turn over on the screen. They add another brick, they see it being added in the drawing. So on the left there, we have intelligent Lego. This is slightly smaller than a Lego block. You can stack them vertically, and you can build the Taj Mahal on the kitchen table and do all the daylight calculations of perspectives by lunchtime. Now, we're trying to generalize this. How can we move this model into a more generalized state? And at the Architecture Association with the Pioneer Diploma Unit 11, which started in 1989, rather confusingly called Diploma Unit 14 then, we first made an attempt to do this. This is the end of year exhibition, and on the left there you see what we call the universal constructor. What it is a great pile of cubes, 12 by 12 by potentially 12 high, logic space. And you'll see this in the exhibition. It's also working. And I thank to this point the Building Centre Trust, who kindly provided the funds to restore some of these very old models to working order. Each of those cells has a number of states. So it's in fact a complex three-dimensional cellular automata with which you can interact. You can go into the space and you can move the cubes around. You may do that, but please not tonight. We have to take the cover off. It's covered just for safety. It's very fragile, but if anyone's really interested, they may come back and arrange that we'll take the cover off and you can play with this and interact with this and see what happens. Each of those cubes is a simple handleable object, so it's easy to grasp, and I answer that money box in fact, with 8 light-emitting diodes inside it. The 8 light-emitting diodes give you 256 possible states for it in binary code, and therefore you can pass signals. So you can pass signals up and down stacks, and you can pass signals through the board. And each cube can be something or pretend to be something else. So for example, one of the students used this for dance. What would happen is you would go into the exhibition space, you would arrange an environment by arranging the cubes in a particular configuration, and then when the program ran, it would suggest what the computer thought ought to be done in response to this environment. Where should you put some new cubes? And it solicited, we didn't use a robot arm or anything tedious like that, it solicited your response back, you put the cubes in, it asked you to help it, and it just winked with the red lights. One little wink with the red light meant please put another cube on top, and 2 little winks meant please take me away. So by winking at you with its red lights, it got some cooperation from you, and as a result of this, it could get you to rearrange the model to suggest the kind of thing it wanted you to do. I'm just going to show 2 very quick examples of this. One is by Pete Silver. First of all, you have to understand that those cubes, now, there was a lot of argument in the unit then as to whether we should make them lots and lots of different things for clarity. The decision was made by the unit to make them cubes for universality. The idea is called the universal constructor, in deference to von Neumann, that it was universal logic states in space. So architecture at that point was being seen as simply a logic in space, and in this case, visual logic. I'll explain an explanation to anybody else so they can see what was going on in these complex internal workings of the computer. Now, Pete Silver made this very elegant splining machine in order to show that you didn't have the numbers coming into these motor control arms are being fed out of the digits coming out of the cubes, and that controls the motors. And this is also running in the exhibition. And this shows how this, in fact, this apparently prosaic cube-like landscape is in fact full of three-dimensionally curved shapes. And here is a tool for mapping. And again, you'll start to see this in the next sequence, where we show that these aren't really cubes at all, but cube 63 is, shall we say, a pink oblong, cube 95 is a stretching blue sphere, and so on. So this next sequence by Stefan Siemüller, done in 1991, starts on the left with an arbitrary array of cubes taken from the exhibition. This sequence is some 2,000 slides long. I'm just going to show 8 pairs. I hope you'll be relieved to hear. So the jumps appear rather severe. On the right, it's now mapped to include a little bit more colour. It's now mapped to show colour and some displacement and some geometrical distortion. This is just coming from those numbers indicated with those coloured lights, nothing more. Now they start to rotate in space and leave traces of their rotation. Now they start to relieve themselves of their rectangular geometry and start to become curved and spherical-based toroidal based spaces. These are real, I say real, I be careful how I choose my words here. These are real models in a virtual environment. That is, they're virtual models. You can move around them, fly through them, turn them round. But they are out of your control. They are being evolved by the controlling program from that initial configuration of cubes. And some very unexpected forms have emerged from this. The final ones became bird-like and flew. Now, just to remind, that has come from nothing more than the grey cubes at the beginning. It's nothing more than the cubes you see at the far end of the exhibition space generated this sequence of computer graphics. There was a little manual intervention, I can confess with hindsight, but that was largely due to incompetence rather than anything else. The techniques for controlling this, and of course, at any one stage, none of us expected the next step. There is no real way in which I could say that we anticipated that outcome from those initial stitches. And of course, it could have gone a lot of other ways. And I'm going to talk in a moment about how you control those evolutionary processes. In the meantime, we explored other methods of computation. An ordinary serial computer is a rather tedious machine, particularly for learning. And we wanted to try and, instead of giving the rules, as we've been doing up to that point, try to get the machines increasingly to learn the rules that they would use. With much stronger technique, if we could find a way of getting it to work. And so we looked at things like neural networks and genetic algorithms. Now again, genetic algorithms are a very specialist technique, which I'm going to talk about later in the course. For the sake of this evening's lecture, it's perfectly adequate to assume it works as an exact analogy with normal biological genetics. That is, they breed, they cross over, they mutate, and they perform in an environment on which natural and artificial selection can occur. Neural networks was a particular attempt to build learning machines based on closer analogies with the human brain and the richness of interconnectivities in the networks. This model is also in the exhibition, but it is not working, and I can tell you now it never really did work properly, or its predecessors did. Simple example of a genetic algorithm. Instead of telling it the rules, say you wanted it to draw a classical column, it's a trivial operation to give the computer the rules. In this case, instead of giving it the rules, we gave it a bunch of variables. The programming for this is done by Peter Graham, one of my research students from the University of Ulster, who's in the room. Peter has spent 3 or 4 years working on genetic algorithms. What they do is they breed a whole population of columns, and the most successful ones are interbred, and the next generation arrives. Now, from that, there are 2 possible outcomes. You can either breed, and sorry about the slides on the left, a perfect column, that's perfectly a classical column according to James Gibbs's rules, or on the right, a rather more sturdy one, which might suit some particular alternative aesthetic preconception. The point about this is merely to say how easy it is to get these programs to learn rules. This particular program, if I'm right, Peter, it learned James Gibbs's rules in about 35 seconds from knowing nothing. And you can train it to your own potential simply by picking things, by interfering. The difference in analogy is the one on the left is occurring by the equivalent of natural evolution, where things that are successful in a particular environment are more likely to breed and therefore more likely to succeed in future generations. So particularly successful variations are encouraged or prone to be encouraged. And again, we're having specialists talk about the actual process of evolution. The alternative is more like breeding dogs or racehorses or Pekingese. If you want to make a particularly fast racehorse, you can pick 2 and say, my intuition is that those 2 will produce a better horse. Or if you want to breed a particularly revolting Pekingese, or a particularly repulsive column as on the right, you can pick a particularly squat progeny and breed them simply by picking them off the screen. Now, I have to confess at this point, we tried this before. The previous life at the AA, I think about 18 years ago, we tried to do this and totally failed. That was our attempt then. I managed to find these slides in the attic. It got worse and worse and worse. all that happened in the meantime is that our technology's moved on our knowledge of how the computing algorithms work, and computing power speeds so much faster, you can discover what's happening so much quicker. And these are much more up-to-date versions by Manik Rastogi. It's evolving a surface here in response, this is being evolved by a genetic algorithm in response to certain environmental, in this case primarily solar radiation criteria. Now, we've got a model, hypothetically, evolving in some hypothetical conceptual environment. The next question is, in nature, we know what the feedback is. It's whether the thing lives or dies, breeds or doesn't die, attracts a mate or doesn't attract a mate, manages to eat or not. What is the equivalent in architecture? How are we to get that information? So we started looking at ways of sensing the environment, and a model, hypothetically, evolving in some hypothetical conceptual environment. The next question is, in nature, we know what the feedback is. It's whether the thing lives or dies, breeds or doesn't die, attracts a mate or doesn't attract a mate, manages to eat or not. What is the equivalent in architecture? How are we to get that information? So we started looking at ways of sensing the environment and interacting with it. And this exhibition from 1980 was, 1992, was a universal interactor where each member of the unit built one or two input and output devices, and they were all wired together to interact, which in the exhibition we showed in the form of this laboratory bench. Underneath was a great deal of wire, and on top were a series of gadgets which you could fiddle with. Some were input, some were output. You can see here on the left, you can see a mask by Eddie Kohler, sound systems underneath here by Will McLean, down here on top I see Chin Lin. There's a bendy balls here by Nicola Lefebvre. It's being controlled by stepper motors, which causes this to bend and distort as the motors control it. In the middle, every student project came into this rack, hence the technical pun of interactor. And they designed all their own circuit boards. The reason for showing this is simply to remind everyone of this. It's because we're going to assume that we have to buy these boards somewhere. Who knows where they think we buy them. But each one of the bits of electronics you see has been designed and built by the students concerned, even those which are now rather more sophisticatedly on printed circuit boards. You'll see a slight improvement in our engineering over the period of the exhibition, I hope. The latest model, which was finished about an hour and a half ago, contains 96 printed circuit boards and looks a properly engineered job, but it is still being designed and built by students only, with some help, I must say, from others where possible. This is Will McLean again. And then there are a whole series of devices which measure things to do with the environment. For example, this is sensing movement. These rings are by Nicola Lefebvre. The idea that you might, as computers get smaller and smaller, you'll have the problem of finding the computer. You know, where did I put it? You know, things only the size of a grain of sugar. Where was it? Clipping onto your ears or your fingers seems a perfectly reasonable idea. The problem is going to be interfacing with it. So her suggestion is very simply that these little bendable finger rings, as you manipulate, this is a three-dimensional joystick and allows you to move around in three-dimensional virtual space. You can wear a sweaty data glove if you prefer it. This is a folding blanket by Tim Yakner. This allows you to explore folding space very intuitively. Folding spaces, by controlling the computer, is really quite tricky. But this is a very intuitive device. You simply get hold of this blanket with light-sensitive devices on it, and you simply fold it into shapes, and the computer then maps and follows the folding that they're doing. It's an output device by Eddie Kohler. There are 12 very powerful electromagnets around the bottom of this thing, which gives it an almighty thump. It's derived, as you can probably guess, from a Frey-Otto structure with the wires running different distances up this. It moved very violently, and it moved in response to emotional states. If no one was looking at it in the exhibition, and we had sensors around the exhibition telling where people were, it would suck and move around in a sulky manner. If you came to look at it, it would flick around excitedly. If you went right the other side of the room, it would get very aggressive and start thrashing about in its cage, which is why it was caged. This is because Alan nearly took Mickey's eye out on an early demonstration. Controlling all this, though, in the middle was a genetic algorithm. This is by Ichiro. And Ichiro had in the middle some particular building like. Around that is some environment being explained by arrows. Things might be solar movement, wind, or whatever. And on the other side, a desirable environment to be achieved. This is expressed in genetic code in very simple binary form. And these are the mappings of successful cells in the structure which are finding more and more successful ways. This isn't the shape of the building, I have to explain that. This is the shape of the growth of the successful cells which will control the building. What we're talking about this evening is primarily process. This is a process-driven experiment. The process to generate form, not by, in the end, components as I started at all, but more like the instructions in you tell your body how to process the meal you've just had, or are just about to have, into the next bit of kneadable body. The instructions inside your genetic code process that into whatever's next needed, and that process is the way we're trying to operate, not by a component thing at all, but by driving a process-driven system. We look particularly at solar problems in an attempt to try and apply some of this. We were horrified to discover that most architects got their solar geometry wrong. And we got involved with Ken Yang out in Kuala Lumpur, where they have a particular problem. Ken is preoccupied with this notion of trying to generate an appropriate form of high-rise building for the tropics. And of course, what's happened is they've tended to import inappropriate Western models and add rather pathetic sunshades. As you fly in, you can see the sun missing the sunshades and going straight into the windows it's supposed to be shading. And I have to say it, and I hope Ken's here, even on some of the better architects' buildings. And this needed urgent attention. So our unit went and had a look at this, and Guy Westbrook, amongst others, generated, Guy, who's now a technical tutor, developed this series of drawings, which are simple ways from the computer of accurately mapping the solar movement in a way which is actually appropriate to the way in which architects think. Most of the solar diagrams in books on the subject are actually not plans at all. They're stereographic views, and architects take them to be plans, and there is the beginning of the most ghastly misunderstanding, which is perpetuated in almost every book on architecture. The cover of a recent well-known book on the subject has a seriously wrong diagram right across the front cover. Now, this is a little bit more, this is trying, most of these tools, though, analyze what you've done. This is Madik Rastogi developing here an automatic solar shading device that develops the minimum necessary shade for you, which is most surprising shapes come out of this, the minimum organization to produce, because you don't have to design the shape. All you have to do is make sure that what you do fits within that envelope, and then you can be sure the window is properly shaded. Now, Guy Westbrook, our technical, took this a lot further, and Guy started evolving buildings which were naturally better self-shaded. He took a circular form, not because that was ideal, but because the circular form most obviously shows up the problems, because the sun goes all the way around it, so you have to see every possible bad case and good case. And so here you see a building evolving for a latitude only slightly off the tropics, otherwise it would be symmetrical, and it's trying to evolve a self-shading form in the most optimum manner, both the overall form of the building, shown here, and the individual shading of these strangely shaped and twisted eyebrows, which are the most efficient way, the minimum surface, to keep the sun off the building. But this was merely a kind of, like, we're just testing our toes gently in the water to see if we could apply some of this to real problems. Only partial problems. Now, another little digression here is that nature proceeds by symmetry breaking. You start off as a spherically symmetrical seed, and it's fairly self-evident you don't end up like that, so what happens in between? Your cells only divide some 40 or 50 times. And what happens is, as the cells divide, they lose their symmetry. In order to understand this, you have to understand three-dimensional symmetry. This poses a very big problem, because most books on architecture only talk about two-dimensional symmetry. They see the third dimension as being an extension only as 2 dimensions. So with a research assistant, Heather Ray, and myself, there are 230 of these spatial symmetry groups, and we developed a computer program that was able to manipulate and develop all of them. I mentioned this really to point out that we had to develop most of our own tools as we went along with this, because simply we didn't have on the market the things that we needed. They usually appeared about a year later, rather frustratingly. So a lot of the things we painstakingly developed, we could have saved our time. But on the other hand, by doing it ourselves, you actually do really understand the inner processes. And I think there's a lot to be said, actually, for reinventing the wheel, because that's what the learning process is about. And in learning it, something new turns up every time. Now, in this example, close packing, everybody in the world knows everything about close packing. Fuller did it to death, every chemist did it to death, but they didn't. They all missed several things. For example, we can't find any source that shows that if you have a fault line like that, you can get it to self-replicate. This is the discovery of Lefevre. If you make a cast of a fault in a packing, you get a shape like that. Now this is of great importance because in information theory, continuity is no information. The information rests in differences, in other words, in faults. So the notion is that the information can be coded in the faults in the structure. We're using a spherical self-packing geometry now rather than cubes, I should explain in passing at this point. But we're interested in the faults in that structure. Now, the biologists concerned with the origins of life are particularly interested in the notion that the earlier self-replicators, the question is how did DNA evolve, the earlier self-replicating forms might have been minerals. And if minerals and clays, and how did they self-replicate? Well, the answer is it could have been by the naturally occurring self-replicating faults in the geology. So the thing over there might be your ancestor. Granny and Grandma. And this is exploring the fact that not only do these faults self-replicate, but they breed inside structures. And that's another sequence by Frazer. Now, am I going to show this live? Got it? Yeah. Right. I'm going to, instead of showing us on slides, I'm going to run this live on the computer, I think. Perhaps. It's the environment. Here you see the two co-evolving. This is a two-dimensional solid automata controlling the structural growth. This is the controlling the growth of the 3D rules. And this surface is the surface between the structure and the environment as it tries to fight to build the most successful surface. As you can see, it's got itself in a bit of a twist at the moment, but nevertheless, this is the first time we successfully demonstrated that you could evolve a form by the interaction between two different systems. We tried both different competing systems and one system in the environment. Can we run the next? The next one with a bit of luck is a cube. This one is another cube sequence, this time evolving from just the one seed by a series of rules which it's learning as it goes along. This hasn't been given all the rules at the beginning. It's developing them in response to an environment against which it's testing itself. Does this work in the environment? If not, I'll try another strategy. Now, normally you'd stop at the end of one of these runs and rerun it. So we're only going to show just one run, just to show the principle of how these things work. So here you can see them negotiating the cells between themselves as to what to do next. They look at their neighbours, they talk to their neighbours, each one knows where it is, what it is, why it is, and the rules for its existence, and they negotiate their next move in state space. I have to emphasize again, nothing has been added, as the adverts go. It was just the grey cube. It was quite a smart grey cube, but very, very primitive compared with even the most primitive life forms still, in terms of the complexity of the information. Now at this point it's stabilizing, and now an important thing is starting to happen, that it's starting to use its state mappings to change its geometry. You can see here it's starting to grow, it's changing color. It's using the information. This is just exactly what happens when a seed, say a seed bud on a tree, is suddenly triggered into action, having been dormant for some reason. We have a very good man coming to talk about trees called Adrian Bell, from Tree Architecture, who's fascinating if you've never heard of him in the series. And it's exactly what happens. It's in our model it's happening. I don't claim this as I never claim any of this is an accurate model of any biological or natural system. We're using